It has been over a year since my wife initiated a romantic relationship with Edward Patterson. I was initially uncertain as to why I permitted this to persist for such an extended period. Perhaps it was due to a sense of complacency that arose once I became aware of the circumstances. I ceased to express concern and instead awaited the imminent presentation of divorce papers. I did not take any measures to prepare for this eventuality, except to compose myself mentally. I came to accept that she would take half of my accumulated assets. She would also retain the house and its furnishings, which had a combined estimated value that was less than it is now on mortgage. We had saved precisely enough to cover the costs. In 3 years, I would transfer ownership of the company to Mara, who would likely demand a portion of the funds. Mara was relatively restrained about her affair. The primary issue was that Patterson worked in the same company as I did. He worked in a different apartment and earned a salary 1 level higher. At least he was single and fairly attractive. What I disliked was his arrogance. I was able to avoid him at work, and the only time I had to interact with him was in the company's social department. Everything was resolved. Following the conclusion of her first semester at Penn State, Mara and I found ourselves alone at home for the first time in 18 years. This period of solitude presented an opportunity for a couple to engage in sexual activity, yet neither of us was inclined to do so. Mara often cited fatigue or a lack of time as reasons for her reluctance, while I was similarly unmotivated. On that particular Saturday morning, Marcia was in the shower and I was absorbed in reading the morning newspaper when the telephone rang. I was not expecting a call, so I simply allowed it to go to voicemail. The message that was left was, at the very least, an intriguing one. It stated, "Malcolm Jewelers calling. The engraving on your watches is. The task is now complete, and the watches can be collected at any time. Thank you for your attention." That was an intriguing conversation. I do not wear watches, and the presence of an engraving on my wrist has never been an issue. Mara had no reason to engrave her watches, and Jenny used her mobile phone to check the time. I have never been one to indulge in such frivolous pursuits. One might indulge in one's spouse's whims or any other personal indulgence. However, on this particular day, I felt a strong inclination to do otherwise. The receipt from the jeweler's shop was situated in the pocket where he kept his credit cards. I perused it meticulously, noting the happy tag and the engraving Hoyer Carrera watches with black alligator leather strap on the reverse side. The inscription, Forever Mara $3, was also visible. The item was priced at $900, fully paid. I carefully placed it back and proceeded to consume a cold beverage. I was acutely aware that this item was not aligned with my personal preferences. Mara had just returned to the living room as I stepped outside to commence the lawn care tasks. The completion of the yard work required twice the usual time, but this afforded me an opportunity to reflect on the situation. Marka informed me that she was planning to spend a night at her sister's house in Frackville. She did not miss the broad smile on my face. I spent the remainder of the evening organizing my affairs. I had a full year to do so. I had waited until the last minute to make a decision. I was critical of myself for procrastinating, but I was relieved to have finally made a choice. She returned home around noon on Sunday. We were in close proximity, but we hardly spoke to each other. It was the longest Sunday of my life. That night, I slept on the couch. Monday morning began normally at work until Edward began showing off his new watch to all his colleagues. I had resigned myself to all of this until he glanced at me with a wide grin on his face. Up until that moment, he had always been calm. He had previously been silent about the affair, but now he was gloating. This was a significant misstep. I immediately took a week off and then informed the personnel department that I was now ready for a transfer to the Baltimore office. The new position came with a promotion and a salary increase. I had declined the offer on several occasions before because Mara and Jenny did not want to move. The remainder of the day was spent at the bank and with my lawyer. I made an offer to Mara that would have given her everything but alimony and a share of my future pension. She could have all the money left after we paid. Given the considerable income generated by Jenny's college education, there was only a limited amount of financial support available. My wife was not present when I relocated to a nearby apartment on Tuesday. By midweek, the divorce papers had been delivered to Mara. She called me on Wednesday to request a discussion. I informed her that I was not in a position to engage in such a conversation. Mara, the divorce papers have been a long time coming. Signing them will facilitate a resolution. I am the one who will be adversely affected. You will gain financially, while I will lose out. Despite my 20-year contribution, you have not offered any support. If I had included alimony, it would only have been for the duration of your remarriage. I had assumed this course of action would be futile, but it has proven otherwise. The matter will be concluded within 90 days. If you wish to alter the terms, I can guarantee it will take more than a year. I am simply seeking to move on, and I understand that this will be a significant transition. I also wish to clarify that I was aware of the answer to your question. Does it matter at this moment? No. There was a pause in the conversation. Mara, I am someone who has been hurt here. I am the one who is being forced. Despite my innocence, I am being punished for moving. I have been aware of everything related to Paddington for years. I request that you sign the necessary documents. I am sorry, John. I never intended for this to occur. Tomorrow, I will submit the papers to the lawyers. I was presented with an ideal opportunity to shift the blame to her, but I refused to allow her that satisfaction. On Friday, I arrived at work and cleared my desk. My absence was not anticipated, and some individuals expressed discontent with my failure to organize a proper farewell party. I was not inclined to engage in festivities. I spent less than an hour tidying up before leaving. I called Jenny and attempted to explain the situation as best I could. How might one inform one's daughter that one is leaving because of her mother without explicitly stating the disrespectful reason she requested on one occasion and then abruptly changing the subject as if she had some inkling of what was transpiring? I was perplexed by her apparent lack of awareness, particularly given the considerable time that had elapsed. I sensed that she was aware of the somber nature of the Baltimore trip. My thoughts were dominated by the life I had built with Mara and the ease with which it could be undone. I was devastated. I had always planned to settle down with her, but now I had no plans for the future. In reality, I didn't care. Mara never once apologized for her actions and didn't even acknowledge them. We avoided that topic. We both knew what was happening, but neither of us wanted to be the first to bring it up. A man can cope with all this, thinking about everything. I turned on the radio. Who the hell is Lady Gaga anyway? The new job was simpler than I expected, to put it mildly. I was overqualified, thanks to my competence and subordinates in the assurance department reported feeling comfortable around me, which was a positive development. I maintained contact with Jenny, who shared all the information she had about her mother with me. Patterson relocated to our residence with Mara a week after I left Jenny, which caused her distress, and I could not blame her. Mara signed and agreed to all the terms of the divorce, and did not even hire her own lawyer. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and I was forced to wait. When we approached the point where there were only 3 weeks remaining until the finalization of the divorce, I enrolled in a 10-day cruise. I embarked on a cruise in the Caribbean, despite my aversion to such voyages. However, this particular cruise was unavoidable, occurring on the weekend preceding my scheduled departure. I had the opportunity to reconnect with old friends from my hometown in Atlantic City. I hosted them for a wine-tasting session and a formal dinner, providing them with entertainment. It was a pleasant experience to reconnect with familiar faces. The 10-day cruise was a challenging experience, as I found the food and at times, I was approached by multiple women, who appeared to be seeking companionship. I utilized the various ports of call to alleviate the monotony of the journey. Upon my return, I was greeted by several individuals, who identified themselves as detectives from Baltimore. However, they had been dispatched by the Pennsylvania State Police. The body of Howard Patterson was discovered at a rest area on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He had sustained fatal injuries consistent with being beaten with a baseball bat and had died en route to the local hospital. His wallet and watch were missing, indicating that the crime may have been a botched robbery. However, investigators subsequently uncovered evidence suggesting that Patterson was involved in a relationship with Marcia, identified me as the primary suspect. Local law enforcement confirmed that I had been on a cruise for the past 10 days in less than 30 minutes. The Pennsylvania State Police deemed no further investigation necessary. I had received at least a dozen messages on my phone. Jenny had informed her mother about my plans to go on a cruise, but Marcia was insistent. Upon attempting to contact me, Marcia was aware that I had an aversion to cruises. One of the calls was from Jenny, so I returned her call. "Jenny, I have just returned from my cruise. What has transpired?" There is no definitive answer. My mother is distraught. Howard did not return home from work one day, and that night, he was discovered on the highway near downtown. He had been beaten and died before he could receive medical attention. I was unable to transport him to the hospital. This incident occurred last Thursday. I was in Cancun at the time, so I was not the one who provided the assistance. My mother believes that I am somehow involved, but there is no evidence to support this claim. I have spent a significant amount of time with the local police, and they have expressed satisfaction with my account. Therefore, I am uncertain why my mother is attempting to contact me. My mother is currently experiencing a significant decline in mental health. She is also in the process of attempting to halt the divorce proceedings. However, she lacks the necessary authority to do so without my consent. Had I waited a few more days, this issue would not have arisen. The subsequent week was characterized by a series of phone calls from Marcia and a lawyer named Winstead. I chose to ignore these calls. Prior to the finalization of the divorce proceedings, I received a registered letter demanding my signature. My secretary was able to delay the delivery, allowing me to leave the building. I spent the subsequent 3 days in Atlantic City before returning home. I contacted my lawyer, who congratulated me on successfully thwarting Marcia's attempts to halt the divorce proceedings. He then requested another $10 from me. After a brief interval of awkwardness, he began to laugh. The humor was of a poor quality, but it did provide a degree of levity to the situation. Instead of money, he requested a steak dinner. It was a worthwhile expenditure. I still considered the joke to be of poor quality. I never fully understood why the police ceased their investigation into the murder of Paddington. They ceased all communication with me. Jenny called to extend her congratulations, though she was restrained in her expression. Mara was in a deep depression. Her sister Sherry had been staying with her for a while. Mara suddenly realized she had significant financial problems. I smiled as I ended the call. I did not speak with Mara for the next 2 years. For the following 2 years, I had no contact with Mara. I did not keep track of her or inquire about her activities. I spoke with Jenny on a monthly basis, but we both avoided discussing Mara. I was aware that she had lost her house due to financial difficulties and was employed at a women's clothing store in a local shopping center. Mara informed Jenny that Howard had 2 insurance policies in which his mother was listed as the beneficiary. It appeared that Mrs. Paddington was not amenable to sharing. I had a few dinner dates, but nothing romantic or sexual. Later that same year, Jenny announced that she was getting married in June. I had met this individual on a few occasions and was gratified by her choice. The wedding was scheduled to take place. The ceremony was to take place in Harrisburg, the groom's hometown. It was therefore inevitable that the groom's father would be responsible for the majority of the expenses. I was willing to provide assistance in any way I could. The future groom had a larger family than we did, which made the situation understandable. I agreed to attend and act as the bride's maid of honor if Jenny could guarantee that I would not have to sit next to Marcia or interact with her in any way. She reluctantly agreed, stipulating that she did not wish to interact with Mara in any way. She was concerned that if she did so, it would result in a greater likelihood of a meltdown than if she simply avoided her. In addition to purchasing a tuxedo, there was one further item on her agenda to prepare for the wedding. She considered her actions to be somewhat mischievous, or perhaps more accurately, her behavior could be described as mean. The ceremony commenced, and it was evident that the nuptials were a resplendent affair. Jenny had kept her word, and meticulous arrangements had been made to ensure that Marcia and I could avoid each other without attracting undue attention. Despite my solitude, Mara was accompanied by a distinguished gentleman of approximately 50 years of age. His identity remained a mystery, and it was unclear whether he was a colleague, a neighbor, or someone else. Her new boyfriend was, frankly, of no consequence to me. At the reception, Mara and her escort sat in the far left corner of the head table, while I was in the far right. I patiently awaited the father of the bride's toast when it was my turn to speak. I crossed my fingers, hoping it was a silly little prank, but I still wanted everything to go as planned. I was handed the glass, which I held in my left hand. The words that I uttered were inconsequential, but my gesture towards the room was significant. I raised my left hand, and the sleeve of my tuxedo slid down, revealing the beautiful Hoyer wristwatch with a black alligator leather strap. I held my hand up for a longer period of time than was necessary, ensuring that the exquisite watch was visible to everyone in the room. A sudden gasp from the far end of the table indicated that my mission had been accomplished. I spoke for a longer period of time than usual, simply to provide a brief interlude of levity. When I sat down, I wore a broad smile. Marcia saw the watch and recognized it. She was gratified to see that all of the plans had paid off. A few minutes later, I saw my former wife. My wife and her companion exited the room, appearing distressed. However, it was unclear whether they were crying. I spent the subsequent hour engaged in the role of a dutiful father. I then quietly departed and returned to my hotel room. That night, I slept restlessly. I was uncertain about Mara's actions, or whether she would take any. If she did nothing, I would know she had accepted her fate and was prepared to move on. If she remained upset about the incident, I might receive visitors. The answer came at 6 o'clock. At midnight hours, Mr. John Terrell arrived with two companions, both attired in dark suits. As I responded, I was suddenly struck by a vision of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in their roles in the film Independence Day. I allowed myself a brief, internal chuckle before responding, "How can I be of assistance?" The man in the suit, the dominant of the two, introduced himself and his partner, then requested permission to enter. They were not local residents, but hailed from I was uncertain as to the rationale behind their early morning visit. I gestured for them to take a seat while I completed my preparations. I had anticipated their arrival and needed to dress before they came. The hotel room was furnished with only 2 chairs, so I sat on the unmade bed. I took my time, deliberately prolonging the process. To settle in, may I inquire as to how I can be of assistance? Are you the John Terrell who was in attendance at the Peterson-Terrell wedding ceremony yesterday? I was informed that during the reception, you were wearing expensive Tag Heuer watches. I reached for the bedside table and retrieved the large-sized watch. Affirmative. I was indeed wearing these timepieces. However, the provenance of the watches is inconsequential. What is of greater importance is the reason behind your inquiry. If you are unable to provide a satisfactory answer, I will not be obliged to divulge the source of the watches. Instead, I will answer your questions. Mr. Terrell, we are attempting to make this as straightforward as possible. Could you please answer the question? I purchased the watch on eBay, and now I would like to know why you are inquiring about it. The watch in question is identical to the one you were previously holding. It was taken from the body of a man who was killed in downtown 3 years ago. There are undoubtedly numerous similar watches. Could you be a little more specific? They seemed somewhat uneasy. I had a feeling they were about to escort me into a government building to conclude the conversation. Mr. Terrell, did you know a man named Howard Patterson? Of course I did. I used to work with him. He was the man who had an affair with my wife, which led to... This information led to my divorce. Mr. Patterson had the same watches when he was killed. How do you know that there was no response from either of my visitors? Were there any watches with him when he was found? They both shook their heads in unison. Do you think these could be his watches? They were supposed to be in control of. I was not privy to this unofficial interrogation, but it seemed as though the two men were losing their composure. Who informed you that these are Howard Patterson's watches? Your wife, Mr. Terrell. Your wife identified the watches. How did she know they were his? There was a slight hesitation. She claimed she purchased them for him. Perhaps you should. It would be beneficial to speak with her about this matter. She did not respond, and that is the extent of the information available. There is an engraving on the reverse of the watches that will corroborate her assertion. Can she provide proof that she purchased these watches? She has a receipt. I also have a receipt. As I retrieved a folded document from my wallet, they sat silently. I then produced the document from my wallet and handed it to them. The principal officer glanced from the paper to me. He then inquired as to whether I had indeed purchased the watches for the stated sum of $49. I confirmed that this was indeed the case, but that I had additionally paid an additional $5 for shipping. He then inquired as to whether I had purchased the watches secondhand. I confirmed that I had indeed purchased a TIG Heuer watch, but that it was not a tag model. He then directed his colleague to examine the description of the watches. The description did not register on their faces, as they were too preoccupied with the discrepancy in the brand name. It states TIG Heuer, yet the tag reads Heuer. They examined the dial of the watch with great scrutiny as I handed it to them. They then turned to their partner, who also took a close look at the dial. One of them turned to me and said, "Did my wife purchase TIG Heuer watches from Mr. Patterson?" The TIG Heuer watches for him were a source of disappointment for both men. It was evident that things were not going as planned. "May we take a look at the back of the watch, Mr. Terrell? Do you wish to check the engraving?" "Yes, do you mind?" "No, not at all." I handed them the watch so that they could examine it at their leisure. I made my point, and I was satisfied with the outcome. As they both stood up to leave, I buttoned my shirt and apologized for the inconvenience. "Safe travels home," I said. After they left, I closed the door and examined the watch. I was gratified to have spent an additional $20 on the engraving on the back of the watch. I turned it over and read the inscription in Old English, "Eat and Die." It would have been a relatively simple matter for them to ascertain the serial number of the watch, but that would have detracted from the humor of the situation. I proceeded to drive back to Baltimore, cognizant that my wife remained displeased with my handling of the matter. I could not blame her, but I had hoped for some degree of remorse on her part. My distress stemmed from her continued desire to she could have chosen to hurt me or get even. After all, it was she who had cheated, not me. Perhaps it was time for me to get even. I hurled the TIG Heuer watch out the car window and reached into the glove compartment. The difference could only be felt before putting on the real watch. I read the inscription for the 1000th time, "For VR Mara." I couldn't stand it. Wearing the watch, I began to contemplate whether I could eventually become accustomed to wearing these. I resolved to persevere until the conclusion of this endeavor, in accordance with the advice of the renowned musician, Old Blue Eyes. I extend my gratitude to those who have followed this narrative until the end.